Hello, friends, and welcome to Worldbuild with us, the podcast where we create fantastical worlds with help from you, our listeners. My name is Rob Hilferty, and I'm here with my co-hosts Daniel Quinn and Courtney Staples. On today's episode, we have a brand new, hot and spicy world-building prompt for the rest of you today, coming in from a user by the name of John Doe. Not a pseudonym, I assume literally just their name. The prompt is as follows. I love fairy/fae court young adult novels. They're sexy, otherworldly, and mischievous. So obviously they want us to build a setting based around that concept, with the tenets, some of them being names should have power. There is a system of different courts, and their beauty and art is dazzling. So a big thank you to John Doe. So a big thank you to listener John Doe. And remember that if you want us to build your world, you can always go to our website, worldbuildwithus.com, submit a prompt, and we will build your world within a reasonable amount of time, as long as it's not creepy or weird. And sometimes weird is okay, but just not uncomfortable weird. But in addition to that, you can always follow us on social media over at Let's Worldbuild on Twitter. You can come join our Discord and become part of our community. And if you're feeling particularly generous, you can always give us money over on Patreon, with a link for both of those in the descriptions. Plus, this is the second time that I'm going to be referencing this, but we just started to put out patron-only episodes up on our Patreon. So if for some reason your lust for world building cannot be sated by a regular podcast, come and listen to us yammer on about whatever our patrons want us to talk about that month. So we should have an episode up already, and it should be very interesting, kind of like a smash and Anyway, go to our Patreon, link in the description. Check it out. If you want to listen to it, you can give us any amount of money over on Patreon. And for one, you'll get our undying gratitude, which should be payment enough. But two, you should also get a patron-only episode. But on to the tenets. Now, normally, I let one of my co-hosts go first, but this time, I'm actually going to be doing something a little bit different. So I wanted to go first and introduce my first tenet, which is the Fae mimic, or at least represent, a natural cycle in the world, and their mortal offspring represent the interstitial phase within that cycle. So Courtney and Daniel, what I want for you to do is I have two options, and I want us to choose which of those phase cycles we want to focus on more. So I have, for my options that I'm bringing to the table, the cycle of life and death, which is they'd have the Fae courts of birth and death. And then the interstitial nature, the mortals that represent the in-between, would be growth and decay. The other option that I had was the sun and the moon, with the mortals representing dawn and dusk. So I also love Fae, and I love their tricksy, mischievous ways. And I wanted to stick to something fairly close to the folklore, keep them within the natural realm, but I wanted to do something that wasn't just seasons or wasn't just the fairly typical nature thing. So, Courtney and Daniel, which of those options are you most interested in?
That's a tough one because I like them both a lot. I guess I was immediately drawn to the life and death one, but then hearing the sun and moon, I think I'm leaning towards that one now. Daniel, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree, because I think Sun and Moon has more metaphorical explanatory power. Like, the first one, it tells us what it means right off the bat, whereas the second one, we can decide what it means.
Not only that, but I was thinking that with the sun and the moon, because you can have dawn and dusk or even stars, it doesn't necessarily shackle it to a fantasy-based setting either.
Yeah.
Right. Not only that, but I like the idea of like a starfaring or intergalactic style of Fae as well. But so I'm hearing from the both of you that sun and moon is what we want to go with, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So again, I do want to emphasize that these are natural cycles. So the the sun and the moon rising and setting and all that good stuff, with dawn and dusk being the representatives in terms of like these half mortal, half fae types, which could technically be elves, but we'll get into that, I guess.
That can lead me to my tenet, since you mentioned intergalactic space elves.
Oh, was that a setup for you, Daniel? Was I not anticipating your dive into the science fiction universe? Go right ahead.
Well, you're anticipating a dive into something, but it is not science fiction, in fact.
Oh my.
One of my tenets is that the setting is modern day, either a portal novel or magical realism.
That was actually my other tenet. It was going to be a modern day setting.
Awesome.
Oh, wow. We haven't done modern day in quite a way. I can see why this is attractive to both of you. That's good.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
good.
So when you say modern day, let's kind of tamp that down a little bit more. Is it modern in the sense that there's magic, or is it modern in the sense that this is the world as we know it, and this is an alternate world where magic and the fae exist?
My thought is it's either a portal situation, so a portal novel, or it's magical realism. So in either of those cases, it would have to have the real world be involved, like the actual literal world that's real.
Mm-hmm.
And we'd either have a separate world of magic, or it's overlaid on the existing world.
Okay, so there's some potential for like an urban fantasy element to it then.
Yeah, so like a portal novel, for those not familiar with it, that's like your Narnia situation where there is a parallel reality that has magic in it that it crosses over, that you move between. Magical realism, on the other hand, takes kind of mundane reality and adds fantastical elements to it, but ultimately it's actually fundamentally mundane.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
See, Gabriel Garcia Marquez. There's actually a lot of Latin American writers tend to drift into magical realism, but I would also argue that something like Piranesi by Susanna Clark is also magical realism. But yeah, we can talk about that later. The focus, I think, that Daniel's trying to emphasize with that aspect anyway is on the mundane aspect. You know? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Maybe we should get some more tenets before we kind of agree to one or the other. What do you think?
Sure. Yeah. Let's get going.
All right.
I mean, I don't really have any strong preference for either, just that it's a modern day setting rather than your typical fantasy setting.
Yeah. No, I'm cool with that. Yeah, absolutely. So Courtney, what was your tenet that Daniel didn't steal?
So playing off of the kind of requested tenets from the listener about words having power and art being beautiful, I wanted the magic to not just be based on like single words or names, but full lyrical compositions.
Oh.
So singers and poets are often like the most powerful magicians in the world.
Interesting.
And that could also mean, for example, that like music played when troops are marching into battle is actually imbuing those soldiers with magical power, or lullabies like actually soothe babies with magic, and so on.
That's very cool. Yeah, I'm already like trying to create these narratives in my head of like the principal character being like a musician who somehow gets wrapped up in the fae. But I'm jumping like 7 hours ahead of myself here. So yeah. All right. So let's talk a little bit more about that. When you say that musical compositions are power in and of themselves, it's not just about individual words, but like a collective is what I'm hearing.
Yeah. Like thinking to stories like Wizard of Earthsea, where magic is based on like a single true name for something. I wanted to kind of expand on that here, where it's not just a single word, but combinations of words and how they flow together has more of an impact.
And is this a situation where the fae or the elves have like lyrical names or something like that? Because that is one of my favorite like tropes among the fae. In my own setting, I have 4 archfae who are representative of the seasons. Daniel, I know you've played it. I'm not sure if Courtney did, but they represent and mind you, I think the names are pretty cool, which is why I'm going to say them aloud on the podcast. But we had winter wrapped in iron. We had autumn kissed by starlight, spring cast in shadow and summer caressed by zephyrs or something like that. So all these names that are like kind of ethereal and kind of otherworldly in that you have to say the whole thing in order to get their actual name, you know?
Nice.
Good question on your thing. Now, is it restricted strictly to music, or when you say lyrical, do you mean any language that's not technical, so it's creative language?
Or poetry?
I had in mind like songs and poetry, although it could potentially expand into like prose if that's what you're going for.
Like I'm wondering, like if I write a passage that's lyrical, would that count? Is it really the quality of the magic of the narrative, or is it specifically the musical quality of language?
Interesting.
Daniel wants to know if his spoken word piece will be able to move people with magic.
I hate spoken word poetry. And this I say as someone with a minor in creative writing, or like in poetry in particular.
Yeah. So he has a right to hate those things because he threw away money to get that degree, just like I'm about to.
Thankfully, my undergrad degree was free, so I didn't have to pay for that bullshit.
Yeah, good question. I could see it going that way potentially if it's like flowy enough of a language, or I don't know, invocative of imagery enough.
Because I could imagine, like, if we're saying their names are invocations of some kind of lyrical language, right? I could see a name not just being like a phrase, but it could be like an elegy. Like I might have to perform something to utter their name. So either I perform a song, or I read this passage that's from this ancient text that represents them, or I don't know, maybe there's some trying to think of some, a long romantic poem or something, to be cliched, but that is equivalent to their name.
See, that's actually kind of really and I'm sure that in like common parlance, you would probably use an honorific rather than their full name, but to evoke them, to like actually call them into being, you would have to recite the entire thing.
Yeah, because I can imagine, like, if, I can typically in these stories, like Rumpelstiltskin and all of them, the implication of the name, if it doesn't take a long time and there's not a lot of risks, then it's pretty easy. But if you have to, like, perform something to deal with a fae creature, that makes it harder,
And it's also more purposeful as well.
Right. Yeah, so if you're, like, trying to get the attention of something extremely powerful, you're going to have to, like, perform an entire saga poem, essentially.
An opera, could you imagine? All right, we're going to take 12 hours to say this creature's name.
But that's kind of cool, though. I think that's like a really interesting way. And not only that, but like we're obviously kind of coming from like a mostly Western aspect, but we can also dip into like the Arabic traditions of poetry, or even like a haiku or something like that, where they're not necessarily sprawling, but the purposefulness with which you speak those lines and those words in matter perhaps more than something else. You know what I mean? Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah, it does to me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Like, like for example, right? It's like, oh, this is in a sonnet, but they don't tell you if it's a Tetrarchan sonnet or a traditional, like English sonnet or something. What's it called? It's not English. What am I thinking of?
Do you mean like a sonnet from like Shakespeare?
Yeah, but they're like the Tetrarchan sonnet is the one that's Italian. It's by Tetrarch, like he's the one who started it, and it has a different like schema than the ones that Shakespeare used to.
I don't remember the names of the two of them.
It's fine. See,
I can look it up though. Let's see.
This is why you don't get a master's degree in poetry. It's you completely like lose it after a couple of years.
I mean, we focused interestingly enough on formalism, like when we were in undergrad. But again, that was how many years now? 15 years ago. So let me see. You're asking what type of? I'm looking up real quick.
For the listeners who have the bingo card, you can mark off Daniel is an ancient mummy. That'll count here.
Oh, here we go. Petrarchan versus Shakespearean. So Shakespearean sonnets. That's what it's actually
called.
called.
There we go.
Shakespeare's goddamn sonnets.
Okay.
So they're both 14 lines. They both are iambic. Okay, so it's in terms of the stresses. So like the Petrarchan sonnet is octaves and a sestet, and then the Shakespearean one is 3 quatrains and a rhyming couplet. Right. So it's a difference in both. Let's see, the optional difference in the Petrarchan sonnet's rhyme scheme, and you treat the volta at the end slightly differently. So it's a subtle formal difference.
Yes, I only bring this up because I wrote a Petrarchan sonnet when I was in Italy, because I was like, well, I was taking a course.
There's a little ode to it.
Yeah, exactly. I was taking a creative writing course, and they were like, well, you have to write a sonnet. I'm like, I'm going to write a Petrarchan sonnet because I'm literally in Rome, so I might as well. Like I feel like it's only appropriate that I do this particular style.
The Petrarchan seems a bit harder than a Shakespearean sonnet.
I mean, it was I
rhyme scheme is more complicated.
Yes, somewhat. Yeah, I would agree with that.
Oh man, I do miss poetry a little bit, but it's weird because most of the time in contemporary poetry, like seminars and classes, at least 15 years ago, they tend to like not like form, and our professor was just bizarrely, she was like kind of horrified by us because we all wanted to do forms. And so we did that for a long time. We were all very bad at it. That's why we're not poets. But I did enjoy it. And I would say to anyone who's interested in creative writing, definitely take a poetry course, even if you don't like poetry, because it will make you a better creative writer.
I would agree with that. The efficiency that you have to have with poetry teaches you to be a better writer overall.
Yes.
I would strongly agree with that. Yeah. Anyway, this has been Old Man Creative Writing Corner. We're trying to create sexy elves here. So who wants to bring up their next tenet?
I mean, Daniel stole my second.
Oh, that's right. Daniel did
buy you time.
Good jerk.
Yeah.
To make up something else.
While Courtney crams a new tenet as we discuss. So Daniel, what's your second tenet? We'll start there. We'll go in reverse order.
My second tenet is that the population of Fae is dwindling or they are on the brink of extinction.
Oh my. Okay. I'm cool with that. If that's the case, I think that is really interesting with my tenet that I started out with, because it's like there's an implication that there are half Fae or at least mortal Fae walking around with these like interstitial courts, right? Like the dusk and dawn. So does that mean that true Fae are dying or near death or near extinction, but there's a lot more like mortal Fae walking around, or like half Fae rather?
Are we saying maybe that because you're distinguishing between like let's see, dusk and dawn are like the real fundamentals, right? And then there's this intermediary space. So maybe so yeah, it's the opposite actually. So the Fae themselves, the pure-blooded Fae, would represent the sun and the moon. That's
And the in between, the mortals are the dusk and dawn. So
yeah, I was gonna say like if the moon and the sun are the like original ones, and there's an intermediary space, maybe since this is a modern setting that's potentially a portal novel too, maybe these half Fae are the people that are in the regular worlds, that some of them, and then they're the ones that are in the portal are the ones that are dying out, who are the moon and the sun.
Interesting. There's a lot of different directions that we can take that type of story as well, where it's like maybe there's if we're going portal novel with it, right, then the way that I would kind of perceive that is, the Fae are dying off, and so these mortals are all pouring out from the portal realm into the real world in a way, I don't know.
Maybe like there's some communion with normal humans that creates half Fae, and that's what they're trying to do, is perpetuate themselves in the mortal realm.
Yeah, that's a good point. Interesting. While we think, actually, let's get Courtney's idea. Courtney, are you still panicking about another tenet, or can you?
No, I think I've got one. I think.
Okay.
Oh, so rather than like the kind of human force moving into or wait, how would you put it? Sorry.
Well, I was just thinking that like I had this concept that maybe the half Fae or the half mortals are kind of trying to escape the portal realm of the Fae themselves, and they're kind of pouring out, maybe because the Fey lands are dying or something like that. I don't know.
Interesting. What if it was like different in that the fairies had crossed over at some point into the human world, and over time that's why they're dying out, because they've been away from their own realm for so long, and
That's
their connection with their own world is weakening.
It's kind of like it's a Lord of the Rings elf situation where they've just got to go back on the boats, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I mean, you could have both. You could have them they're becoming weakened and dying out because they've left their realm they come from, but perhaps that there is some interbreeding among humans, and that's what's creating perhaps the protagonists, which are the half humans who don't really understand what they really are, that kind of thing.
And maybe the half humans are like kind of blessed in a way because they can exist in either realm without losing their strength.
Oh, they can move between the portal. Yeah. And then it would also explain perhaps they're all very artsy types, and that there's a question of where their genius really, their muse really comes from. Maybe it has something to do with their origin.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, cool. I'm glad that we kind of wrapped that in. Because that's really interesting. And not only that, but we are subconsciously adding in the other chord of the Fae that I had in mind, which is the cycle of life and death. So we're kind of playing into that, even though we're doing the sun and the moon, which I think is cool. I'm totally fine with that. Yeah. So I guess I'll throw in my second tenet, because I feel like we're at the point, and I'll give Courtney a little bit more time to scramble. But the other concept that I had is the only two ways to gain power amongst the Fae are through pranks or seduction. But their viewpoints of both are remarkably skewed and alien.
How so? What do you mean?
So the concepts that I kind of had in mind, right, is that if you want to impress someone of the Fae, or if you wanted to gain favor amongst the Fae, or even if you were a Fae yourself and wanted to essentially rank up, you would have to pull off a performance, like a prank, or seduce someone that was so impressive that it's like this. It's like, I'm keeping it kind of like vague and convoluted, because I want to allow for some alien strangeness to come in for the rules of the Fae. But essentially, right, when I mean by their viewpoints of both pranks and seduction are skewed, is the prank could end up in someone being murdered, but it has to be funny to the Fae in some way, right? Like it has to be kind of humorous. Or if you seduced someone, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're seducing them, sexually. It could mean that you have, I don't know, like maybe it's like a power structure thing where you've seduced them with money, or you've seduced them with fame, or something like that. And the way that and so both involve some level of planning and trickery and forethought, where your conveyance of power is through superior intellect. Essentially, that's kind of what I'm looking at.
So since this is like kind of a modern setting, I'm now picturing some show that, like a reality show that has to do with fairies pranking people.
Oh,
and
no.
how ridiculous that would be.
No, that sounds awful. Like it's just a prank, bro, was the furthest thing that I had in my mind.
Oh, here's a thought. So a couple of things. So if we can expand what is a prank fundamentally? A prank is something that amuses the prankster, right? Something
and
that's
often
meant
humiliates the other. Yeah.
It could humiliate them. Sometimes the person pranked also is amused by it too, even if they are humiliated.
Yes.
So there's a kind of magic in the joy it invokes, right? Or the potential disparagement, right? But fundamentally, a prank is a falsehood, right? Like what a prank. Yes. The way that prank works is you're doing something that's fake in order to produce something that's real, a real effect, right? So the amusement. Yes. So I'm wondering if this could be expanded. Maybe in the Fae world, the typical behavior is pranks, but maybe that could be expanded to be if you can create a falsehood that has a great lasting effect, or the more of an effect it has, the more powerful it is, the more interesting it is to them. So if you translate into the modern world, what could that be? And how could that be dangerous?
Yeah.
a conspiracy, maybe
Yeah.
like a scheme, like a pyramid scheme, or
Oh,
perhaps
yeah.
like, street art that is like a Banksy situation. Those might all be magical acts that are like pranks from the perspective of the Fae.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's a great interpretation of what I had in mind, Daniel. That's really great.
I mean, you could have a capitalist who is like an executive who pulls off this crazy scheme, like was it Gordon Gekko kind of scheme that is a prank unto itself. But I wonder if the farther you get from the artistry, the more of a problem it is with the magic. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, there's certainly a lot that we can talk about there, but I mean, I'm sure that there are people out there who have heard that, certain QAnon, like ideas and concepts are pranks, right? Like the whole ivermectin. There was that rumor going around where it's like ivermectin was actually like a leftist prank on QAnon folks, which is
or like trolling. It's like, when does a prank become a troll?
Yeah. And honestly, like I think because we can maybe lump in trolls with the Fae, like it could have a literal meaning as well.
Oh my god, are they the ultimate? Are the Fae like the ultimate trolls, like the really original ones?
I mean, like potentially, yeah.
Oh my god, Q is a Fae. The real Q.
Yeah, and it's like how much, and maybe it's like there's different levels or different aspects to, like the outcome of a prank. So maybe it's like they're just feeding off the chaos in this case, like, wow, I can't believe that this person pulled off a prank that's now causing the deaths of thousands. Wow. And then like there's like Fae who are just like clapping and like in awe of the master.
Well, I mean, if you think about it, like it doesn't have to, I mean, it can be nefarious, but like even if it killed people right in the end, I think what they derive from it is that you did this thing that's false that produced such an effect, which really is the nature of art. Like we create a story to invoke some feeling in someone that we felt potentially. So that's the value, the strength of the story. So the strength of the prank is how much of an effect can we get out of this falsehood. And I mean, that speaks to the whole nature of the magical world, which is a falsehood.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I have been telling Courtney and Daniel that I've been reading Jean Baudrillard's Simulation and Simulacra. And guess what, Daniel? That's directly applicative to what I'm talking about. But
there you go.
I want to move away from that because that's a little bit too esoteric even for me. But what I do want to talk about is maybe the perception of the prank and the seduction depends on the court of Fae that you're trying to curry favor with. So like, if you're causing mayhem and chaos and like misery, maybe the Fae of the moon are kind of into that. Like maybe it depends entirely on who you're trying to impress.
Right. I think so.
I could
the
see
nature
that,
of the prank.
Yeah. And it could also, Daniel, since you brought up like capitalist fairies, maybe that's part of like the corruption of the human worlds. Like, and that's what kind of takes them away from the artistry of their own realm. And that's why they're starting to die out, because they're sort of embracing these more human qualities than they would normally in their own world.
Interesting.
It's like a degrading of the art, because I could see that, like, you really have to stretch things to say that a capitalist prank, a corporate takeover, while there is some skill involved, it's so far removed from producing an effect that's really art,
Yeah. More and more artifice gets in the way of the genuine movement, the awe that you might feel when, otherwise perceiving some level of art.
Like I'm picturing some like CEO who is in fact a Fae who left 1,000 years ago and has moved from company to company over the ages and has forgotten what he is, because he's so good at the craft that at the craft of business now.
I like to think in my fantasy world that I can create and control that the original philosophers who enabled capitalism are the original archfey, and they are directly responsible. Yeah, exactly.
God damn it.
Unfortunately, not the case, but why not?
So I feel like NFTs would tie in well here, like getting people to buy a link to an image for like thousands of dollars.
Oh my God, Courtney, you hit the nail on the fucking head. 1,000%. Yes, absolutely. Oh God.
I mean, what's neat too is like, depending on how this is told, like you can tell it from the perspective of regular people who may have certain talents. So someone who is an NFT curator who knows that they're bullshitting people and is coming to terms with that. But then suddenly the story takes this strange magical turn because they realize that their ability to create these NFTs and trick people is something more than just their skill, and it's related to the other world. And then you get into all kinds of cool magical realism stuff.
Yeah. And not only that, but I think another aspect that we can kind of explore here is like with the concept and the onset of algorithmic art, maybe that's also decaying the overall power and effectiveness of the Fae as well, where as things start to become less and less from the spirit of the person, of the artist, it's starting to it's kind of like if the Fae only ate a diet of like sugary cereals where, they could live off of it, but it's really bad for them and it's going to wither them away. You know what I mean? And the original joke I was going to make is like the Daniel diet being nothing but candy.
Pre 2014.
Yes, exactly right. Yeah. It's like nothing but candy and Coca-Cola. It's like, that's exactly right. Yeah.
I mean, you raise a good question because then it's like, what's the role of technology in this world? And I imagine in the classical fantasy sense, it's somehow opposed to the magic,
But it doesn't necessarily have to be. I think that there's something else there, right? That takes away from it, because with the idea of like mass marketing artwork, mass marketing like the songs and everything. Actually, hold on. We've been kind of approaching this as like an NFT situation, but remember that there's also algorithmic songs and stuff like that coming out as well. So we can even talk about that aspect to it. I think what we might be able to explore is not, the idea that technology is degrading to the magic, but this idea that this third force that removes the human element is like, that's what's degrading, what's decaying the overall, Fae themselves. Like
the automation aspect of it.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Like, technology enables a form of automation that's not typically possible. So it's like, while using a computer is not a problem, using the computer to automate the creation of artwork could be, because the artistry really lies in the initial programmer and not the execution of the program thereafter.
Exactly right. And that's exactly what I was going for, Daniel. Yeah. Thank you for clarifying that.
That means that programmers can be artists.
Oh, nice.
Although we're just frauds. Don't even. Just all frauds.
I mean, most artists are. So I think that's totally fine.
It's true. We're just especially shitty. Like, if you guys only knew how shitty the internet is. Oh my god.
It's pretty terrible.
As someone who's been on there for decades, Daniel, I think I kind of get an idea. Yeah.
There's stories I could tell about how it's basically piles of Band-Aids and toothpicks that can be destroyed at any moment. But I would like you to be able to use your browsers with relative peace and serenity.
And that's where our sponsor NordVPN comes. No, I'm kidding.
I wish.
That actually would be very fitting for everything that we're talking about.
Yeah.
But okay, we've had this conversation going on for a while. I'm already seeing like the viewpoint in my mind is very fixed. I have some more questions, but I hope that we've also burned enough time where Courtney can give us her final tenet. Courtney, what do you have for us?
So it kind of does tie into what we were just talking about, but given that fairies have this reputation for being a bit mischievous and like prone to pranks and stuff, I thought that them having a love for games would be an interesting element to toss in. In terms of like, it could be, something as simple as like a board game or chess or whatever. Or we could, since we're in a modern world, go into like actual video games or more complicated gambling systems and things like that. But the idea of like,
I really do love. I'm sorry.
The idea of just a mix of like luck and skill involved in winning a game and probably the satisfaction that they would get out of beating somebody.
Oh
like
yeah.
that.
And I'm going to avoid the obvious Squid Game fairy edition.
Yeah.
But I do love
Please
the
do.
idea that like you can basically have an escape room made by the Fae, and it's like legit dangerous, and it's like,
Yeah.
oh, you don't want to fuck with that. You know, like there's so much artistry that we can really mess around with these games as well. I think that it really ties in well with what we've been talking about thematically.
Agreed. I hadn't even thought of
Yeah,
escape rooms, but that's a great one.
I mean, think about MMORPG. Like that would be an interesting meeting a Fae, a real Fae that tends to reside in an MMORPG because that's how it's kind of what do you call it? Evaporated into the modern world, having lost its life and mortality. And you've got a character who's a player who's a half Fae who discovers their true identity through the MMORPG. That'd be a crazy story.
Daniel, if this were a shitty anime, here's what would happen is that a real life person would discover the portal to the Fey world through their MMO.
Yep.
And then they would be trapped in the Fey world. That's how an isekai anime would work. So if we roll everything's an anime on the twist list, Daniel, it's your fault because you brought it up first.
Agreed.
I just want to point that out there.
My life.
And of course, if you die in games, you would die in real life.
You die in real life, yes, obviously. Yeah. What are we, hacks, Courtney? Come on, of course, that's how it works. But yeah, I think that there's a lot. Okay, so this is really, really fun. I'm loving. Like, I again was not expecting a modern twist at all, but the more we talk about it, the more that everything really, I think, clicks and makes sense. And it's like, yes, absolutely. Why the fuck not? So I think with everything working as well as it is, I think now's the time that we roll for the world building anchor and we figure out something that's a little bit more solid about the world.
Sounds good to me.
All right. So for the world building anchor, the first thing that we're going to be focusing on is a hero. Okay. The theme of the hero that we're going to be focusing on is mystery. Very appropriate for a Fae-based setting. So where do we want to go from there? A hero who is an anchor piece to this setting that we have going on here. The theme is mystery. What do we want to focus on?
I think it could be cool to have a sort of Robin Hood-esque fairy figure who's been around now for centuries, but kind of keeps changing their identity over time, so they never get caught. But as sort of a contrast to like the capitalist CEO fairies that we were talking about, but somebody who kind of pranks like corporations and like powerful figures in the world.
Like a Banksy.
That's
pretty much,
but that's actually effective.
That like I was gonna say that where his critiques on capital are effective.
Right, they actually matter.
yeah. No, that totally makes sense. Like we can make an effective Banksy. Absolutely. That's a great concept. I feel like maybe we can look at it in terms of like mainstream art compared to this is the underground, you know, and it does, and maybe it doesn't necessarily have to just be art. Maybe maybe this Banksy figure is also a musician, or, you know, like they're creating, you know, installation art pieces, you know, and their power comes from the consistent pranking / seduction, I guess, of these various corporate figures, you know?
I mean, since you mentioned the word seduction, you could try and make it a little, you also want an alien effect. Maybe like, it's not just one entity, this Fae. Like it presents itself as multiple different things. So it could present itself as like, you know, a group of spray paint artists, or like a group of musicians, or a group of this and that. And it seduces humans or half Fae to join it to help it perpetuate whatever it's trying to accomplish.
It's an art collective. Yeah.
Yes.
Or it's an algorithm, you know, like maybe it's like, it's not like something you can pin down, and the people who represent it are seduced to represent it.
I like that. I'm getting like, for some reason, I'm getting Andy Warhol and like the factory vibes, you know?
Yeah. This also makes me think of this artist, musician guy from New York City. He went by Ram LZ. He was this very like eccentric graffiti artist and writer and painter and sculptor, and like made his own costumes out of all sorts of stuff, and like came up with these characters that he would perform as. And I could see that working as something for this figure, like somebody very just strange and sort of constantly changing their own identity into different people.
I think the word that we've been dancing around this entire time is also avant-garde. I think we've been avoiding that for some reason. But yeah, that sounds exactly what we're going for. Also, I've never heard of Ram LZ before, but that sounds dope, and I got to look them up.
Yeah, he's a very interesting guy.
How do we incorporate this art collective, this Ram LZ / the factory? Daniel, I like what you were saying about earlier, where it's like, it's difficult to pin down because it's not an individual necessarily. It's about the collective. In this way, is it a literal hive mind in terms of like a fae, or is it like a seductive lifestyle that is like stemmed from an individual? Like, because in my mind, right, like if we're looking at this as like the prank side is basically like, you know, like the capitalists, right? And this kind of like artist collective are the seducers, essentially, right? Is that how we're approaching this whole different like courts of fae and stuff like that? Or am I just looking at it in a different angle? What are we thinking here?
I guess what I'm seeing is we haven't really established what the antagonist is, but we seem to be hinting that the antagonist is some degradation of the ability to create pranks and to evoke true emotions in people through false things, art, right? So I'm guessing then that the this amalgamated art group was probably opposed to art being degraded, because which is the force of capitalism in some way, so the businesses. So I'm wondering if maybe within the Fae world, there's really more. There's a couple of courts. Maybe one court is almost trying to transplant itself into the real world through capitalism and business, but by doing that, it's actually weakening everything for them. And there's one court that's rebelling against that by trying to pick up the half breeds, maybe breeding with them, the humans, to kind of get them on their side and save both worlds. You know, so the pranking is trying to remind, you know, the old Fae of what they were by pranking the things they've created, these falsehoods of economy. And it's also reminding the humans that there is a magical world out there where you can create this kind of art. So maybe there's two courts. One is the old court that's bleeding away because of its alliance with like greed and capital, and the new court, which is trying to attract, you know, half elves and humans into its you know, what do you call it, influence, and it has to hide itself because it has these enemies on both sides.
I'm hearing a lot of parallels between like cultural norms and cultural cycles as well. So the way that I'm seeing this is that's like, it's almost like there's the retro side where it starts being cool again. You know, like there's genuine art, genuine like avant-garde, like fashion or art or music. And then there's a cycle where that plays out and it is no longer, you know, popular. And then there's the nostalgia for it. And then it cycles over and over again, right? Like we've seen cycles of 50s nostalgia, 80s nostalgia, etc. I'm seeing something like that, like where you see parallels of the natural cycle with the Fae, but from a cultural perspective as well.
And this is, like you're saying, it's all natural. So maybe when we say natural was your tenet, maybe it has something to do with the naturalness of culture and its evolution.
I'm actually really glad that you said that, Daniel, because I love that. I was trying to figure out a way that we can have natural cycles in a, you know, in like a, and I mean that in the literal sense, like a nature cycle. But I was trying to figure out how to get away from that. And I think this is actually a really cool way that we can do that.
Agreed.
Where we can have cultural cycles that are also natural, but it's just in a different way. That's really interesting, I think.
I think too, like, there are things that are natural for humans, right? They're not necessarily natural for other animals. So this is kind of like, we're social creatures as we create culture. And not many other animals are, but that's natural for us, right?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that I do want, and I think that we're going to be able to do this a little bit more next episode, I do want to make sure that we delineate between the courts of the Fae a little bit more, because I think that that's something that is really important among traditional Fae. You have the Seelie and Unseelie courts, and they have, strong delineations between the two. And I think that I'd like to do that a little bit more, but we are running out of time, and we do have to roll for a twist.
Ooh.
Is it going to be anime?
Oh, man. We can only hope. Well, you and I can only hope, Courtney, but Daniel can squirm
God.
and hope that it's not anime. Anyway, let's roll the die, see what we get. And our twist is, now add in some treachery. Oh, boy.
Ooh.
That's a good one.
That's
I'm looking forward to that. Yeah.
Me too.
All right. Or sorry, were you going to have one more thing? No? Okay.
No.
Okay. All right. That is going to do it for this episode of Worldbuild with us. Remember that if you want us to build your world, you can always go to our website, worldbuildwithus.com. You can submit a link, or you can submit a prompt, and we will build your world, unless it's creepy or weird. And weird in a bad way. I want to emphasize that. If you want to follow us on social media, you can always do so by going to @Let'sWorldBuild. You can also be part of our community by joining our Discord, or if you're feeling particularly generous, or you want to hear those sweet, sweet Patreon-only episodes, you can go to our Patreon, donate some money. Link for both of those in the description. That'll do it for this episode of World Build with us. Remember that we love you very much, and we're going to get through this together. Until next week.